On April 7th, 2026, the Wall Street Journal reported something that hadn't happened yet in this entire war, and it's worth understanding exactly how unusual this specific kind of target was compared to nearly everything else this war had targeted up to that point. U.S. Central Command didn't strike a missile site, a radar station, or a drone storage facility. It struck a room full of people specifically, a large concentration of senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders, gathered together underground in a hardened bunker beneath Tehran. 2 B-2 stealth bombers flew a round-trip mission all the way from Missouri to make it happen, a logistical feat on its own before you even factor in the target they were sent to hit. Let's walk through exactly how that target was found, how the strike came together, and what it tells us about a fight that's increasingly being won or lost underground. Let's start with the moment this specific strike happened, because the timing tells you almost as much as the target itself, and it's worth walking through in careful order rather than jumping straight to the explosion. According to the Wall Street Journal, Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Command, ordered B-2 Spirit bombers to launch that round-trip mission from White Man Air Force Base after intelligence identified that concentration of senior IRGC commanders gathered inside an underground bunker in Tehran, a decision made under real-time pressure with no guarantee the window would still be open by the time the aircraft actually arrived overhead. What makes this genuinely different from a lot of the strikes we've covered throughout this war is the compressed timeline behind it. A difference that becomes clear the moment you compare it against how most other strikes in this conflict have actually been planned and executed. According to reporting from Army Recognition, this wasn't a pre-planned strike against static infrastructure scheduled weeks in advance. It was a dynamic attack against what analysts describe as a fleeting leadership target, one whose entire military value depended on hitting it immediately, before the meeting inside that bunker ever ended, and everyone in it scattered back into hiding, dispersed once again across whatever other protected locations Iran's command structure had available to it. Here's the detail that I think gets lost in most coverage of this specific strike, and it's genuinely remarkable once you understand it. This mission didn't happen in isolation. Separate Wall Street Journal reporting indicates that at the exact same time, American forces were in the middle of an active combat search and rescue operation, recovering a downed F-15E pilot inside Iranian territory. U.S. bombers had already dropped roughly 100 2,000-pound class bombs specifically to prevent Iranian forces from converging on the rescue site. So the B-2 mission against that IRGC bunker wasn't a separate, standalone operation. It was layered directly on top of an ongoing personnel recovery mission, which means American commanders were simultaneously protecting a rescue corridor, disrupting Iranian troop movements, and retasking 2 of the most sophisticated aircraft on the planet toward a completely different, time-sensitive target, all within the same operational window. Think about what that actually requires from a command and control perspective, because it's easy to read past that detail without appreciating how difficult it actually is to execute. A downed pilot recovery is already one of the most complex, resource-intensive operations any military can run. It typically pulls in helicopters, fighter escort, close air support, tanker aircraft, and dedicated command oversight, all focused on getting one person home safely while under fire. Layering a completely separate, intelligence-driven strike against a hardened underground target on top of that same operational window, using an entirely different category of aircraft, flying in from another continent, means whoever was running this fight had to track 2 urgent, fast-moving problems simultaneously, allocate scarce resources like aerial refueling support across both, and make sure neither mission compromised the other. That's not something you improvise casually in the middle of an active war. It reflects a genuinely mature, well-rehearsed joint command structure, capable of holding multiple time-sensitive threads at once without dropping any of them. Stick with me here, because understanding how intelligence actually pinpoints a target like this, buried, hidden, and only vulnerable for a narrow window of time, is the real story behind that headline. Let's talk about what intelligence identified a concentration of commanders actually means in practice, because that phrase, which shows up constantly in reporting on strikes like this one throughout the war, tends to get repeated without much explanation of what's actually behind it, and I think unpacking it properly is worth doing carefully rather than rushing past it toward the more dramatic parts of this story. We got a rare concrete window into exactly this kind of process just a few weeks earlier, with the strike that killed Khamenei himself on February 28th. According to an Israeli source briefed on that operation and cited by ABC News, Israeli intelligence discovered that Khamenei spent quite a lot of time above ground in his offices, not in his bunker, a detail that directly shaped how and when that strike was executed. The Israel Defense Forces themselves put it plainly, saying Khamenei was targeted in a precise, large-scale operation guided by accurate IDF intelligence while he was in his central leadership compound in the heart of Tehran, together with additional senior officials. That's a genuinely important window into how this kind of targeting actually works. and it's worth sitting with for a second. It's not about penetrating a bunker directly. In that case, it was almost the opposite, understanding a target's actual pattern of behavior, well enough to know exactly when he'd be somewhere more vulnerable than his own protective infrastructure. Intelligence services build that kind of picture over time, tracking routines, movements, and habits until they can predict, with enough confidence to actually launch a strike, where a target is likely to be at a specific moment, rather than just where that target is theoretically supposed to be. This is worth understanding as a general category of intelligence work, because it explains why this kind of targeting takes so long to develop, even when the resulting strike itself takes only minutes to execute. Building a reliable pattern-of-life picture on a high-value target typically means piecing together fragments from multiple different sources over an extended period. Nothing any single source provides is usually enough on its own, but the overlapping picture, built from many different threads, eventually becomes precise enough to act on. That's fundamentally different from finding a fixed piece of infrastructure, a missile silo, or a bridge doesn't move and doesn't have habits. But a person, even one operating with heavy security precautions, eventually falls into patterns. And those patterns are exactly what intelligence services spend years trying to map. For the April 7th bunker strike specifically, the reporting available doesn't give us that same level of granular detail about exactly how the commander's location and gathering were confirmed. And I want to be upfront about that gap, rather than filling it in with speculation. What we do know, directly from the Wall Street Journal's own sourcing, is that whatever intelligence picture existed came together fast enough, and with enough confidence, that Admiral Cooper made the call to launch aircraft from the continental United States specifically to exploit it before the window closed. Let's talk about why this particular strike required something as extreme as flying B-2 bombers all the way from Missouri, because that decision itself tells you a lot about how seriously this specific target was being treated. And it's a decision that wasn't made lightly, given everything else already happening in the region that same day. According to Army Recognition's analysis, the B-2 Spirit was conceived from the ground up as a long-range, low-observable penetration bomber, built specifically to enter heavily defended airspace while carrying precision-guided ordnance inside internal weapons bays where radar can't easily pick it up. Its stealth characteristics, intercontinental reach, and capacity to deliver very heavy munitions make it one of the only platforms on Earth actually capable of prosecuting a hardened target sitting near the political and military center of an adversary state, which is exactly what a bunker full of IRGC commanders underneath Tehran represents. And launching from the continental United States, rather than a forward base in the region, sends its own message entirely separate from the strike itself. It demonstrates that the U.S. can generate this kind of combat power directly from home soil, sustain the mission through aerial refueling across an ocean and a continent, strike deep inside Iranian territory and fly home, without depending on any regional basing that could be politically constrained or physically exposed to retaliation. A capability that matters just as much for what it signals to watching allies and adversaries as for what it actually accomplished against this one specific target. Quick pause here, because I want you to actually picture the scale of what's being described, since it's easy to skim past a sentence like "flew from Missouri" without appreciating what that actually involves logistically. 2 aircraft taking off from a base in the American Midwest, flying for hours across multiple time zones, refueling midair along the way, arriving over Tehran with enough precision to hit a specific underground room, and then flying all the way back home. That's not a quick reaction to a target of opportunity in the way people usually picture it. That's an entire logistics and intelligence chain spanning half the globe, compressed into a single mission window because the target itself was only going to exist in that specific vulnerable state for a limited period of time. Let's talk about what these bombers actually dropped, because the weapon itself tells you what kind of target the intelligence picture indicated this was, and the choice of munition here is genuinely revealing on its own, separate from anything else we've covered so far. According to Army Recognition, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, commonly known as the MOP, is a 30,000-pound precision-guided hard-target defeat weapon engineered specifically for destroying hardened and deeply buried facilities. Unlike a standard bomb that simply explodes on impact, the GBU-57 is built to combine enormous mass, a reinforced casing structure, and a delayed fuse sequence, so that it physically punches through layers of earth, rock, and reinforced concrete before it actually detonates, well below the surface, right at the level where the target itself is sitting, a mechanical process that takes real, calculated engineering to time correctly against an unknown depth of hardened rock and concrete. Choosing that specific weapon over anything smaller strongly indicates the target here wasn't assessed as some kind of basic underground shelter. It was treated as a deeply protected command installation, one that specifically required one of the most specialized bunker-busting munitions in the entire American arsenal to have any real chance of reaching it. A decision that itself reflects a fairly confident intelligence assessment of exactly how that bunker was constructed. If you're wondering whether this was the first time this exact weapon and aircraft combination had been used in this war, it wasn't. And understanding that earlier mission helps explain why commanders were confident enough to try it again on a much more time-sensitive, dynamic target. This strike extended a combat pattern first established during Operation Midnight Hammer. On June 22nd of the previous year, 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 bombs against Iranian nuclear-related sites, marking the first operational use of that specific weapon in combat anywhere, ever. That earlier mission proved the B-2 and GBU-57 pairing wasn't just a theoretical option sitting in a planning folder for the most extreme hypothetical scenarios. It was an operationally credible, repeatable tool for defeating hardened Iranian infrastructure. There's an important difference worth drawing out between those two missions, though, because it shows how much this capability had matured in less than a year. Operation Midnight Hammer was a large, deliberate strike package, 7 bombers, 14 weapons, aimed at fixed nuclear infrastructure that had been under surveillance and planning for years before a single bomb was ever dropped on it. The April 7th bunker strike was the opposite in almost every respect. A much smaller 2-aircraft package, launched on a compressed timeline against a target that only existed in its vulnerable state for a limited window. Discovered and struck within what appears to have been a matter of hours or days rather than years of deliberate planning. Going from a slow, massive, years-in-the-making strike against static infrastructure to a fast, surgical, intelligence-driven strike against a fleeting human target, using the exact same aircraft and the exact same bomb, tells you the kill chain behind this capability had gotten dramatically more responsive in the months between those two missions. The April 7th bunker strike suggests that same proven strike architecture had, by that point in the war, been extended from hitting fixed strategic facilities to hitting protected leadership compounds and command nodes identified through fast-moving, time-sensitive intelligence instead of a pre-planned target list. Let's zoom out and place this specific strike inside the much larger pattern of leadership targeting that's defined this entire war from its very first hour. Because a single strike, however dramatic, only makes full sense once you see where it sits inside that longer arc. This wasn't an isolated tactic that suddenly appeared in April. It's been the through line of the whole conflict. According to Wikipedia's ongoing documentation of Iranian officials killed during this war, the opening strikes on February 28th alone killed roughly 40 senior officials in a single operation. 3 separate gatherings of Iranian leadership were hit within half a minute of each other. That list includes Khamenei himself, Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh, 4 top Ministry of Intelligence officials, the head of intelligence for Iran's emergency command, the head of Khamenei's own military office, the chairman and former chairman of Iran's Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research, and the chief of staff of Iran's armed forces, among many others named in that same official accounting. That's not a war that gradually escalated toward targeting leadership. It's a war that opened with leadership targeting as its very first defining act. And everything that followed, including the bunker strike we've spent most of this video on, has simply been a continuation of that same opening logic at a smaller, more precise scale. And that pattern never really stopped. On April 6th, the day before that B-2 bunker strike, Israel announced it had killed IRGC Intelligence Chief Brigadier General Majid Kademi in a precision strike, with an Israeli official confirming that Quds Force Special Operations Commander Asghar Bagheri had been eliminated in the exact same strike. Fox News reported the IDF's own characterization of Kademi directly, accusing him of helping advance terrorist attacks abroad and overseeing surveillance of Iranian civilians as part of the regime's crackdown on domestic protests. An Israeli official went further, describing Kademi's position within Iran's intelligence apparatus in blunt terms, calling him effectively the second most important figure in that entire structure. The same targeting logic extended well beyond intelligence officials, too, reaching directly into the naval command structure overseeing one of the most consequential fronts of the entire war. Later, on March 26th, Israel assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval officer that Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz identified as the commander directly overseeing Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, describing him as directly responsible for what Katz called the terrorist act of bombing and blocking that waterway. U.S. Admiral Brad Cooper, the same officer who would go on to order the April 7th bunker strike, said Tangsiri's killing made the region safer. Iran confirmed his death days later. Removing the specific commander running an entire blockade operation is exactly the kind of decapitation strike meant to disrupt not just Iran's hardware or its coastline defenses, but the actual command structure coordinating how that hardware gets used day to day. And it shows the same pattern we're describing in the April bunker strike wasn't limited to intelligence officials or a single dramatic gathering. It ran across nearly every major operational front of this war simultaneously. So the underground bunker strike we've spent most of this video breaking down happened less than 24 hours after two other senior Iranian security officials had just been killed in a completely separate operation, and it sat inside a much longer running campaign that had already claimed Iran's top blockade commander weeks earlier. That's the pace this specific dimension of the war has run at for weeks at a time. Multiple senior leadership figures eliminated within a single 24 to 48 hour window, again and again, across intelligence, military, and naval command structures all at once. It's worth understanding that this entire leadership targeting approach doesn't come from nowhere. It extends a strategy the United States has been building and refining against Iran's command structure for years before this war even started. The most obvious precedent is the January 2020 strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of Iran's Quds force outside Baghdad International Airport, an operation that itself relied on tracking a specific individual's movements closely enough to know exactly which vehicle he'd be in and exactly when it would be in range. That single strike became one of the most consequential leadership decapitation operations of the last decade, and it fundamentally shaped how both countries have approached this kind of targeting ever since. Iran has spent years since then trying to build in redundancy and unpredictability, specifically to avoid a repeat, while American and Israeli intelligence services have spent that same period refining exactly the tracking and pattern of life techniques that made it possible in the first place. What we're watching play out in this current war, dozens of senior officials removed within the opening hour of the conflict, intelligence chiefs and blockade commanders picked off within days of each other, an entire underground gathering hit mid-meeting, is that same fundamental approach, just applied at a scale and tempo the Soleimani strike never attempted on its own. Here's what I think this pattern actually reveals about the strategic logic driving this entire war, and it's worth spelling out plainly. If you're a senior IRGC commander watching your intelligence chief and a Quds Force Special Operations commander get killed one day, and then learning the very next day that an underground bunker meeting of your own colleagues got hit by bombers flown in specifically from the United States, the message being sent isn't really about any single facility or any single person. It's about whether gathering together at all, anywhere, underground or not, is still a survival decision. That's a fundamentally different kind of pressure than degrading a country's missile stockpile or its air defense network. It's psychological and organizational pressure aimed directly at the people who have to actually run the war on Iran's side, forcing them to weigh every single time they need to coordinate in person, whether doing so might be the exact moment American or Israeli intelligence has been waiting for. Let's talk about what this specific capability actually threatens for Iran's broader wartime command structure, because that's the real strategic story sitting underneath this one strike. According to Army Recognition's analysis, a successful bunker-busting strike against an IRGC compound near Tehran indicates that depth, fortification, and proximity to the regime's own political center no longer provide the level of sanctuary Iranian planners spent years assuming they would. For years, Tehran invested heavily in buried facilities specifically to protect senior leaders, safeguard communications, and preserve decision-making capacity during exactly this kind of crisis. A strike like this one directly challenges that entire underlying assumption, and it forces Iranian military planners to consider wider dispersal of leadership, tighter communications discipline, additional redundancy across command networks, and a much more fragmented posture for actually running a war day to day. Because concentrating decision makers in one place, even deep underground, has now been demonstrated to carry real, immediate risk. That analysis extends beyond just Iran, too, and it's worth understanding why this specific strike resonated well past this one war. For America's allies, an operation like this one reinforces the credibility of conventional deterrence by showing Washington retains a genuinely unique capacity to hold hardened, deeply buried targets at risk without ever needing to resort to nuclear-level signaling to do it. For adversaries watching from elsewhere in the world, not just Iran, it's a reminder that the United States can synchronize entirely distinct operational functions inside a single battle space at once: combat search and rescue, deep strike stealth aviation, and time-sensitive leadership targeting, all under active combat conditions. That kind of integration isn't just a display of raw firepower. It reflects a mature joint force capability to impose multiple simultaneous pressures on an opponent, forcing defensive reactions across several different layers of command and maneuver all at the same time, which is a fundamentally harder problem for any adversary to plan around than facing just one type of threat in isolation. I want to pause here and be honest about something, because I think it matters for how you should read a story like this one. There's an uncomfortable tension sitting at the center of the entire leadership targeting strategy we've walked through today. On one hand, it's a genuinely effective way to disrupt an adversary's ability to coordinate and command a war. Arguably, one of the most effective tools available, short of full territorial occupation. On the other hand, forcing an already opaque, Already unaccountable regime's command structure to fragment and disperse doesn't necessarily make that regime's remaining decision-making more predictable or more cautious. It can just as easily push authority downward and outward toward less experienced, less centrally coordinated commanders operating with even less oversight than before. There's a historical pattern worth naming here too, one that shows up across a lot of conflicts involving hierarchical, ideologically driven organizations, not just this specific war. Removing senior leadership can absolutely disrupt short-term coordination and slow down an adversary's ability to plan complex operations. But organizations built around ideological commitment rather than around any single individual tend to be more resilient to this kind of pressure than organizations built around one dominant personality. Because the underlying structure, the training pipelines, the recruitment networks, the doctrine itself, survives even when specific people don't. The IRGC in particular has spent decades building exactly that kind of institutional depth, with multiple layers of command specifically designed to survive the loss of any single figure, which is part of why a strategy built around removing individual commanders, however tactically successful each individual strike is, doesn't automatically translate into a broken or incapacitated organization overall. That's not a reason to dismiss the strategic logic behind strikes like this one, but it is a genuine trade-off worth naming rather than glossing over. And it's exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when a story like this one gets compressed down into pure spectacle, stealth bombers, bunker busters, a dramatic headline, without never asking the harder question of whether the underlying strategy is actually working the way its architects intend. Let's talk about the limits of what's actually confirmed in this specific story. Because a report like this one, involving classified intelligence, an active war, and a strike inside a hostile capital, deserves that scrutiny more than most. The core details of the April 7th strike, the B-2 mission from Whiteman Air Force Base, the GBU-57 munitions, the underground IRGC target in Tehran, and its connection to the simultaneous pilot recovery operation, all trace back to Wall Street Journal reporting, relayed through Army Recognition's defense analysis. That's solid, credible sourcing, but it's also worth noting plainly that neither CENTCOM nor the Pentagon has, as of this recording, issued a detailed public confirmation, laying out the exact intelligence picture that identified the commanders inside that bunker, how long they'd been tracking that specific gathering, or precisely how many senior officials were actually present when the bombs hit. Army Recognition's own reporting used careful conditional language throughout, describing the mission as reported, and noting that if confirmed in full, it would stand among the clearest recent demonstrations of America's ability to reach protected command infrastructure. I'm carrying that same conditional framing into this breakdown deliberately, because a story built on wartime intelligence reporting deserves exactly that level of care, not false certainty dressed up as confirmed fact. That distinction matters even more here than in a lot of other stories about this war, because unlike a strike on a fixed facility, which satellite imagery can usually confirm within days, regardless of what either government says publicly, a strike on a mobile gathering of people underground is much harder for independent journalists or open-source analysts to verify after the fact. There's no crater you can point a commercial satellite at and count bodies. What we're left with is official sourcing, filtered through outlets with strong track records, but working, by necessity, with information the US government chose to share, which is a meaningfully different evidentiary situation than confirming, say, that a specific bridge near Bandar Abbas was destroyed. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I think it's genuinely one of the harder ones to answer with confidence based on everything publicly available right now. Given everything we've walked through today, a war that opened with roughly 40 senior officials killed in a single coordinated strike, and has continued picking off intelligence chiefs, special operations commanders, and now entire underground gatherings of IRGC leadership at a pace of multiple high-value targets within days of each other, do you think Iran's command structure can actually keep functioning effectively under this level of sustained leadership attrition? Or do you think a regime with this many redundant layers of intelligence, military, and paramilitary leadership can simply keep replacing commanders faster than the strikes can remove them? Put your honest read in the comments, because I think that question, whether decapitation strikes on this scale actually break a command structure or just force it to keep regenerating under pressure, might end up being one of the more important open questions determining how the rest of this war actually plays out. Before I wrap up, I want to be direct about something related to how I've approached this entire breakdown. Stories about how intelligence identifies and tracks specific individuals for military strikes sit in genuinely sensitive territory. And I've deliberately stuck to what's been publicly reported by credible outlets, the Wall Street Journal, ABC News, Army Recognition's defense analysis, and Wikipedia's source documentation of confirmed casualties, rather than speculating about classified tradecraft, technical collection methods, or operational details that haven't been made public. What we actually know from the reporting itself is fairly general. The pattern of life analysis helped identify when Khamenei was vulnerable outside his bunker in February, and that some combination of intelligence sources identified a concentration of commanders gathered underground in April, urgently enough to scramble a transcontinental bomber mission. The specific mechanics behind either of those intelligence pictures, exactly which sources, which methods, which technical or human collection actually produced the confirmation needed to launch, remain outside what's been publicly disclosed, and I think it's important to be honest about that boundary rather than filling the gap with confident-sounding guesswork. Thank you for sticking with a story this layered all the way through. It's easy to watch footage of bombers taking off and think the story is really about the aircraft, or the bombs, or the explosion itself. What this particular strike actually shows is that the real center of gravity in a war like this one is often invisible entirely. The intelligence work that has to happen quietly, continuously, and with enough precision to know exactly when and where a target will be vulnerable, long before a single aircraft ever leaves the ground. One more thing worth sitting with before you go. Every strike we've walked through today, the opening night's 40 officials, Kademi and Bagheri, Tangsiri, and finally the bunker itself, represents months of patient, largely invisible work that never makes it into a headline on its own. The public only ever sees the moment the bombers appear over the target, the explosion, the confirmation days later. Everything that made that moment possible, the tracking, the pattern of life analysis, the confirmation that a specific group of people would be in a specific place at a specific time, happened entirely out of view, sometimes over a period of months, and will likely never be fully disclosed even after this war eventually ends. That's worth remembering the next time a headline about a strike like this one lands, because the visible 30 seconds of footage represents an enormous amount of invisible work that came before it. And understanding that gap is part of understanding how a war like this one is actually being fought. Stay sharp, keep asking where the actual uncertainty sits in stories like this one, rather than accepting every detail as settled fact. And I'll bring you the next update the moment there's something real and verified to report. Sources referenced in this script: The Wall Street Journal, live coverage card, B-2 bombers dropped massive bunker buster bombs on Iran military compound, April 7th, 2026. Army recognition: U.S. B-2 bombers hit underground IRGC command bunker in Tehran with 30,000 lb GBU-57 bunker buster bombs by defense analyst Teoman S. Nikansi, April 8th, 2026. ABC News: Intelligence pinpointed Khamenei in Tehran compound ahead of precise strike, Israel says. March 1st, 2026. Including direct statements from the Israel Defense Forces. Wikipedia, 2026, Iran War, and list of Iranian officials killed during the 2026 Israeli-United States strikes on Iran. Continuously updated. Fox News, IDF confirms IRGC intel chief killed, Quds Force commander also eliminated in strike, by Eric Mack, April 6, 2026.